So I need to move my rings around there so that the hole lines up, that I can put my screws through. And the screws I've carefully put there where I can lose them. That was just the sound of a small bird whacking off the window. They're a bit inclined to do that here. I think the reflection of the sky in the window here fools them. They're only very small birds and they're very light, so they're pretty good at bouncing. Which way up does this go? I would say it goes that way up. Normally that pointer's at the bottom of the shutter. I'll zoom you out, you see nothing. Why can't I find that hole? There. Probably. Let's get a screw in there and tighten that up. Because one of these two screws was loose earlier, which may be of no significance. It might just mean that it needed to be tightened up. It might mean that it was stripped out. That moves smoothly enough. Let me consult my ring here. Can I tell which way up this would have gone? Oh, I think so. I think that's 22. Does that look likely? Yeah, I think that's probably it. Probably that way up. I'll get these two screws tightened. Typically I support this with a block of wood underneath so that the ring is supported when I do the screws up. And that screw is obviously not tight. Here we go. Right, well that's good. It's nice smooth movement. No danger that you'd disturb those settings. But that's nice smooth movement, and there's obviously nothing sticking there. So that part is done. I can turn my attention to the mechanism plate. So the mechanism plate, well, I'll start cleaning this up, and there's a fair bit of dirty marks on here, which may be dirt, dust, grit. Probably some of that is graphite grease, and that's the colour from the graphite grease I'm seeing. But certainly I want all of that gone, because I'll be putting my own lubricant where I want lubricant. And the old lubricant, looking at the surface here, it's quite marked. It's like it's got some galling on it, I think. That's the surface that the cocking ring runs around. It really does need to be fairly smooth and friction free. So I just need to clean all these surfaces and make sure I've got all dirt and contaminants and rubbish off here. I'm having trouble staying in camera view, I'm sorry about that. I'm just inclined to get very focused on the task at hand and drag them, whatever item it is I'm working on, away so that I can get around it and do the job properly. Old grease can always, it's great for gathering up dust and similar, and grit, and all of those things can create like a grinding paste. It'll wear things out if you don't get rid of that stuff. And this surface is where the blade actuating ring runs in that groove, and the blades themselves have to swing out over some of this surface. Now here there's some staining. Now this staining that you see here, that's paint. And that's paint from when this centrepiece here was painted with matte black paint. Now the blades have got a swing over that, so it's not a helpful thing. I'm going to get some acetone and clean that off. Certainly comes away readily enough with a bit of acetone. Now that could easily have been like that right from the factory, or it's when someone has serviced the camera in more recent times and they have wanted to touch up this matte black paint in here, which I can see is not a particularly even layer. It's got some grease staining on there, I would say. I'll clean that with some naphtha. Yeah, the paint job is not a particularly good paint job. It's not particularly even, and I can see how it's run in there, and basically it's been painted with a brush or something like that. The excess is run out of the bottom and just run round those edges, which would not be a helpful thing. Well, that plate's looking a lot better. I need to flush out both of the speed trains, the retard gear train here and the delay action or self timer here, and this little mechanism here, which is the pallets for our flash sink. I want to flush that out well too, and this little lever, I'll need to make sure that moves freely. I can see that there's a bit of a greasy mark on the plate below it, and that may well be causing that to stick or fail to move as freely as it should do. Flush that out with a bit of naphtha. I want my blower now, I think. I'll start with this retard gear train, and basically I just want to run some naphtha on there, holding back the pallets, work the mechanism backwards and forwards, and do it again. And what I'm wanting to do is just shake loose any contaminants that might be on the surfaces. And then I'll blow that out, and as I blow out the solvent, it'll also carry away any dirt or other muck that was in there with the solvent. If you just leave the solvent to dry, the solvent will obviously evaporate and leave all the contaminants behind. If you blow the solvent out while the solvent is wet, it'll take those contaminants with it as it goes, which is what you're hoping to achieve. You're wanting that was another bird hit in the window. You're wanting the solvent to leave the mechanism clean afterwards, not just wet it briefly and go away again. That's moving nicely. And the delay action, they pose more of an interesting problem with these shutters, because these are a little bit odd. They don't have a built-in spring of their own, unlike the self-timers on later Synchro Compurs in the smaller cameras, smaller shutters, had their own spring, which you could then just work by swinging backwards and forwards and allowing it to run down. So here all I'm doing is making sure that I flush this mechanism out, and again blow away that solvent so that it carries away any contaminants. And I've done the same here for this lever for the pallets, for the flash sink. That all seems to work smoothly. Now there's quite a bit of marks on these screws here. These screws at this end and these two here would be used to adjust the speed of the shutter, basically by swinging the retard gear train into greater or lesser contact with the lever as it comes round, or swinging it in at this end, which would hold that lever back, which would mean that the pallets were less engaged with the mechanism. I'm not going to disturb those settings. Normally, if a shutter has been serviced previously and the repairer did a reasonable job, he would have left it in a good state. Once the shutter's clean, there's every likelihood that the speeds will be accurate, or as accurate as they ever were. If you take this speed train off here to flush it out and to clean it, perhaps in an ultrasonic cleaner or whatever, you have one hell of a job getting this adjustment correct again. So unless you are feeling very enthusiastic to take on something awkward, or perhaps you know your stuff better than I do, I just leave the things on there. Once they're flushed out, once they're cleaned, and once I've lubricated them with a bit of graphite powder, you can assemble the shutter and you have no problems at all with regards to the speeds. So that mechanism plate, I'm quite happy with the state of that part. I need to do the blade actuating ring, the retainer plate, and of course that's held in place with 4 small screws. So I need to get these components clean and in position. This shouldn't take long. So I'm looking at the state of the cotton bud here, and I can see it's quite dirty. Now I expect that this component had been lubricated previously, most likely with graphite grease. Some of the dirt here that's coming off is probably not graphite, it's probably just dirt. I'm looking at this closely to see if there are any signs of corrosions on the surfaces that run against the mechanism, corrosion that might cause a high friction spot and cause the shutter to not run as quickly as it should do. So that looks quite good. The retainer plate, now this surface underneath the retainer plate, that's very stained with paint. I'm going to clean that with some acetone. I want all that rubbish off there. Now that would have run against the edge of that blade actuating ring and potentially cause it to not run as freely as it should do. There's quite a bit of paint on here. This is not in the light path. This component doesn't require any paint in that position at all, and this is simply paint that's got there because somebody was painting that inside surface and allowed the paint to run down and through and over and get to places it shouldn't have been. This is not something you would normally strike with a shutter. This is just an unusual situation. Because this is quite a highly polished surfaces on here, and they're intended to be so. There needs to be quite low friction in these components. This face, which was the one with most of the paint on it, that's the blade actuating ring runs against this. And this surface at the top, the shutter blades run against that, so that needs to be cleaned. That wasn't as bad, it was mostly the problem was at the other side. The underside, the side that the blade actuating ring is going to run against. Right, I think that'll do. So the blade actuating ring only goes on in one position. The little tab on it that sticks up here is operated by the lever from the top of the shutter, and that drops into that slot there. The retainer plate only goes on in one position. It's got a locating pin, and that locating pin drops in about there, I think, from memory. There we have it, so the plate's in position. And we have 4 screws that hold this in position. 2 long ones, 2 short ones. Now I marked the plate here where the long ones go. So I'll just start these screws. I won't tighten them up until I've got them all in position. That's the other long one. Now I just made faint scratches on that aluminium there, so I knew where these were to go. You could do just as well. You could do it with a pencil. You could leave a pencil mark there if you so desired, or you could just make a sketch so you knew where things went back. Alright, so the 4 screws are all in position now. I can go around and tighten them up. It's important that these screws are tight, because if they back out, they'll rise from the plate and they'll catch on the shutter blades. That's good, that's moving nice and freely. Well, that mechanism plate is pretty much clean now, and I will lubricate that with a bit of graphite powder before we close that up. But I do want to look at the state of my shutter blades. This is blade number 1. There's a bit of distortion around that hole there. Suggests to me that it had fallen out of place slightly when someone did the screws up on the case assembling the shutter on a previous occasion. That's something you want to avoid whenever you're closing up putting the shutter case back over the mechanism plate. Do the screws up very lightly indeed, and check that everything is free before tightening them up. Otherwise you might end up in a situation where a blade is moved while you've been lifting the case over the back of the mechanism plate, and a blade might end up trapped between one of the posts and the case and get damaged as a result. And I suspect that the distortion I see on that hole in the centre there was caused by exactly that sort of thing. But the blade itself is cleaning up very well. There's no corrosion, there's no obvious problems with that blade at all. That's good. Well, that's blade number 1. I'll go through these, clean all of them up, but I really don't expect to see any problems here, and then lubricate this mechanism plate with a bit of graphite powder, as I say. And the areas I'm wanting to lubricate will be the blade actuating ring, the 2 speed trains, and I don't think I need to do anything to that pallets for the flash sink. That looks like that's running just nicely as it is. So I've got to clean these blades up. Right, well, with my mechanism plate all lubricated with a bit of graphite powder and all blown out nice and clean, I'll just make sure that the blade actuating ring is round in the blade's open position and start placing my shutter blades. This is blade number 1. That goes here. Blade number 2 goes here. Blade number 3. Blade number 4. And blade number 5. Now, checking that all the blades are seated correctly over the fixed pivots and the moving pivots on the blade actuating ring, I can put the shutter case in place. Now, the screw holes on this are not symmetrical, so I can have a look around here and see where they're likely to line up. And it looks like about there. Check that that looks right. 4 screw holes there, that looks okay. I'll run those screws down lightly. Since we got 4 screws, I'll just put 2 opposing screws in here. Flip it over and check that the blade actuating ring opens and closes the blade smoothly, and it does. So the blades are correctly positioned. None of the blades are displaced and caught between the mechanism plate and the case. All 4 screws in place, check again. That's nice and smooth. That's a vast improvement on how it was originally. So I can do up those 4 screws. And there's the shutter mechanism plate back in the case, all our blades nice and clean, and all of that's working very smoothly indeed. So I can start reassembling the components on the mechanism plate, and here I am certainly going to have to consult my previous photos and videos to make sure I know exactly where everything goes, because there's a good selection of parts here that I am not at all familiar with. So we'll start at the beginning. Alright, I'm going to start putting these components back on the mechanism plate. I'm fairly confident I know where most things fit. So I'm going to start with this little piece here which couples to the blade actuating ring, and I'm just going to give that a very small wipe of molybdenum paste in the centre of the pivot. And that sits on the post right there. This lever sits on top of it. And on top of that goes its actuating spring, which goes this way up because the bent down tab goes down into that slot. Here's the retaining spring, that screw. That screw has a shoulder on it that the spring must rotate around. The spring must not be trapped by the collar. It must be free to move. That's good. Now I'll see if I can get the ends of that spring in place. That piece goes under there, and the other arm which is busily trying to escape must swing over the top of this lever and round behind that side of it. Now that spring's trying to get off the screw there. I'll just pop that down into place. Now that's good, that's sitting in position now. So that piece is spring loaded and it's coupled to this piece. Now this spring here needs to go over the top of this, and it couples to, I'll show you, there's this stud here, this rivet, there's a post underneath that. This spring couples to that post underneath there, like that, and that spring acts to hold the shutter blades in the closed position, so that this lever will act against this lever to open the shutter blades, and that springs back into position. Now we have our mechanism here that was designed to hold the shutter blades in the open position for viewing, and I'll put just a wipe of molybdenum paste in two spots there. That feeds in from a slot through the side of the case. Can you still see that? Yes. There's a post, which I don't need sitting on the shutter blades. There's a post here which fits up in this spot when I can get it screwed into position. It's just started, that thread. I'll make sure that's actually square and started correctly. That's better. That's down in position. That's the guide post for that lever. Now there's another lever that runs on top of that here. Oops, what's that bit of fluff? if I can get that positioned correctly. Where's that lever go? Is that on the wrong side? It goes like that. That was another bird striking the window. Having a day of it today. That's correct.